welcome to yet another edition of E-Expressions with the New Indian Express. I have with me Fareed Zakaria, who really, for a lot of people, well, half the globe or maybe more, is their GPS, their GPS to the world as it is, the world as it will be. And he's written again a remarkable book, 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World, right? A lovely book which really sums up what we're going through and how we got here, which is, I think, almost as equally important. Hello and welcome, Mr. Zakaria, and good morning to you, I guess. It's quite early in the morning where you are.
It's a pleasure. I'm wide awake though. My 12-year-old daughter goes to school, and I just made her some dosas.
Great. Dosas are the flavor of the season, of course, with Kamala Harris as
Exactly.
Vice President-elect. How is it? Are you getting a lot of feedback on, one of us has got there, or is she really still regarded as very much Black American?
It's interesting. I think she is regarded more as an American Black than an Indian American. But the truth is, she has both identities, and that's part of the reality of America today. You have these mixed and multiple identities, and honestly, she can emphasize one or the other depending on where she is. She was raised by an Indian mother for most of her growing up. So I think it's fair to say that certainly in cultural terms, the Indian influence is very strong.
And not just Indian, but South Indian. The South Indians back home are very excited about the whole idea of ammas and chittis finally, sort of gaining precedence over the very Punjabi diasporic culture that we've had so far. So I think the multiplicity and the plurality of India will be represented a little more, I guess, in that sense. Mr. Zakaria, talking about your 12-year-old, I was struck by what you wrote. One of the things that you wrote in the book was about how you used to spend you had to budget for your calls home, and how your 12-year-old daughter just does 5-hour FaceTime calls with her friend in Singapore, and really how the world has changed and data has changed all that. That's just one of the many changes that you talk about. But really, what is the change that you see in America currently? Is Trump gone, but is Trumpism very much alive?
The way I would put it is, Trump was never personally very popular. There was a part of the country that was mad about him, that was crazily devoted to him. But if you look at his average approval rating, it's among the very lowest of American presidents since we've been counting, and that is since the late 1940s. So he is not really generally popular. But I would say that he became a tribune for a certain group of people in America who feel dispossessed, who feel as though the world is leaving them behind. And they feel this for a number of reasons. Some of them are economic. They feel that this wave of globalization and technological change has left them behind. But another part of it is cultural. I think it's very important to remember in life that, and I don't need to tell Indians this, that culture matters, that people vote a lot because of these cultural symbols and signposts and markers. So I think for a large number of less educated white Americans who live in rural areas, and these are often very good people. I don't mean I'm just describing them. They are less educated. They live in rural areas, and they are mostly white. They look at the new world of a kind of multicultural, urban, cosmopolitan America with a great deal of anxiety and fear. And Trump weaponized that. And he was able to say, they are the enemy. They are the ones, they are the reason you are doing badly. They have sold you out to the avatars of globalization. So that feeling is still very strong. And I think that Trump uniquely represents it because he is seen as a fighter, and he's seen as somebody who is willing to take on the establishment. I don't know how much it will translate. My guess is that Trump will continue to dominate the Republican Party, but that others will struggle to have the same kind of hold he had. It's really extraordinary, and nobody quite understands it. It's partly derived from the fact that he had a kind of celebrity status, and then translated that into politics. We often forget political celebrity is a very small part of the real world of celebrity.
Right.
And so in a sense, he crossed that boundary, but the feeling is real, and that feeling will persist.
In many ways, the story that he tells Americans is the story that Prime Minister Narendra Modi tells Indians. That there was an elite, and it had to be dismantled, and a new elite, or they don't use the word elite, but a new India had to be born to on, and it could only be born on the ruins, or on the if the old India had been dismantled and destroyed. So, do you feel a lot of that echoed in India as well?
Absolutely. I think you make a very, very powerful parallel. In many ways, this phenomenon that we're seeing is part of a global phenomenon, because what's happened, what are the two forces that have really dramatically changed the world over the last 30 years? I talk about this in the book a lot. Um, Globalization and the information revolution. And the effect has been to dramatically produce growth and change in societies. But the people who have benefited from these two forces are disproportionately educated urban people who have some technical knowledge often. If you think of yourself in these terms, are you somebody who manipulates
Hmm.
words, letters, symbols, numbers for a living? Are you a symbolic analyst of some kind? A
Right.
journalist, a consultant, a businessman, a lawyer, a doctor? All those people have benefited from globalization and the information revolution, but the others have not benefited that much. And so you have created this extraordinary class divide in every society. Somebody wrote that the big dividing line in this election in America was diplomas and density. If you lived in a densely populated area and you had a diploma, you voted for Biden. If you lived in a sparsely populated area and you didn't have a diploma, you voted for Trump. So that reality is true in large parts of the world. I'd say almost all of the world. The Brexit vote follows a similar line. The opposition to Emmanuel Macron comes from the rural areas, people with less educated. If you look at Erdogan in Turkey, you have that same phenomenon. Now, Modi has taken it and weaponized it in an even more dramatic way, I would say, because he has turned it, exactly as you said, into a story of a new elite drawn from the countryside, replacing the old, decaying cosmopolitan elite that he sees as, having been wedded to the old ideas. But he has then weaponized it very specifically against Indian Muslims.
Yes.
And I think that makes it even more sad to say. It makes it powerful because it is always easy to focus. It's always easy for people to believe that their problems are because of somebody else,
Right.
and there's some enemy within. And because it allows you to focus your attention on one thing rather than the complexity of life. And so while I think it's very powerful in India, it's also very dangerous. And so I look at it with great, great apprehension. And I hope that at some point there will be, in the past, these efforts have founded on the fact that India is so diverse, so complicated that, you try to play this card and then the lower castes resent it or the South resents it. And so I think eventually the plurality and the diversity of India will reassert itself and not allow for this real kind of us versus them mentality. But so far, one has to say what Modi is doing is working politically for him.
That's because I guess the reason is that there's no storyteller who has emerged in India currently who tells India's story as powerfully to Indians as he does. And I think that is his biggest asset. If you look around the political field, it seems a complete wasteland in India. I don't know if you've spent some time looking at it, but there doesn't seem to be an adequately powerful leader opposing his story.
I think that that's very true. And if you think about it in these terms, since the death of Rajiv Gandhi,
Yes.
India has really not had a powerful storyteller, a leader who could drive this kind of narrative. So what India has been a series of relatively weak coalition governments, and then Modi.
Yeah.
And so Modi is really the first person since the 1980s to have been able to capture that high ground that Nehru established in the 1950s. Um, I always thought in some ways India was more democratically governed with these coalition governments, and it turned out, of course, that some of those prime ministers were very good. Narasimha Rao, I think, in retrospect, looks like a very able and competent and pluralistic prime minister, someone who recognized the diversity of India. But India also has a tendency to want strong men and these very powerful images, whether it's Indira Gandhi as Durga.
Women as well.
Yeah.
That's the only good thing about them, about us, I think. We're not perhaps as publicly misogynistic as Americans are. I just wanted to bring the attention back to America a bit. How are Americans taking to Kamala Harris? Because they had a huge mental block about Hillary.
It's a good question because there's no doubt that Hillary faced some degree of opposition just because she was a woman. You can see this in the vote for Biden. Biden gets a certain number of white suburban voters who didn't vote for Hillary. Now, they're basically very similar candidates. They're both centrist Democrats. So clearly something was going on there. Biden, as a 78-year-old white man, maybe may seem more reassuring. The truth is Kamala Harris has not cut a very large figure on the American stage. But I'll tell you, I think it's an unusual circumstance. I don't think it's her fault, which is we've had a pandemic. And, normally you assert yourself by traveling around the country, you do a lot of media. All that has been curtailed. So I think it's fair to say that she hasn't really had a kind of massive impact yet. I suspect this will all change. I think we are approaching the post-pandemic world with the vaccines and things like that. And once that reality of a female, vice president, a woman of color is asserted, look, I think it'll galvanize a lot of people and excite a lot of people. But what the Obama case shows is that it also makes there will be people who are apprehensive.
Yeah. Exactly. And I wanted to bring that in. When you look at the people that Biden is choosing, a lot of them have that Obama hangover, don't they? They're familiar figures from the Obama administration, or they were second rung at that point, and now they've grown to be part of his government. Is there that fear?
Well, there is that fear. I myself am somewhat reassured by it. I think what Biden's cabinet so far largely represents, one could quibble with a choice here and there, but what it largely represents is the belief that government is hard, it's important, that people of competence and experience matter, that you don't choose your government officials on the basis of somebody you met at a cocktail party, somebody you think who looks good, or somebody who you heard defending you on television. I mean, this is literally how Trump would pick his cabinet. He didn't want to have John Bolton for the longest time because the guy had a mustache. I mean, this is really how he was picking his people. Biden is doing the opposite. He's picking a lot of low-key people who have a lot of experience in government. And I think particularly American government, but the same is true in India. Getting government right is very hard. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of energy. That's why you have this extraordinary reality with the United States, with the best assets in the world in public health, the Centers for Disease Control, the National Institutes of Health, the Mayo Clinic, the Johns Hopkins, all that has ended up with this abysmal performance. It's as my friend Rachel Maddow said, if you can have the best car in the world, but if you don't know how to drive, it doesn't help.
In fact, you talk about quality over quantity, and I think that's really important. You talk about the quality of governance, and do you think the focus is going to go back to that? You've said that it will, not just in America, perhaps, but globally. The quality of the kind of governance we get, the kind of healthcare, education, that'll be back on the agenda.
Well, I hope so, because the really striking feature of this pandemic, and as you said, there's a whole chapter on this, is how the real stars of the pandemic, the countries that have handled this the best, have not been the countries with the largest governments or the most dictatorial governments. China did okay, fine. It started off on a very bad footing, then recovered very well. So it gets ultimately a very good grade. But the real stars are Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, even Hong Kong. And what did they all have in common? Two of them are democratic, two of them are not. What they have in common is a relatively small government, but a very efficient, competent one, very clean. You know, the government officials go in and are respected. In a place like Singapore, they are paid like private sector people. And so the whole culture and ethos is one of technocrats who are empowered, who have agencies that have authority, very little corruption, and as a result, a lot of trust with the people. So when they say put on your masks, people put on the masks. When they say don't go to restaurants, people don't go to restaurants. That culture is something that, you know, frankly, the world needs to copy from, which is not the size of your government, but whatever government you have, to make sure that it functions well for the public. I mean, this is, as you know, India could learn this lesson more than any other country. I think that one of the tragedies of watching the Indian response has been just how, you know, on any scale, the Indian response has been abysmal.
Right.
It has been badly conceived, badly executed. As a result, India may have the worst economic fallout from COVID in the world. I don't know of another country that has suffered as dramatically economically as India does. There's no reason it should have. It has a large internal market. It was just terrible implementation of pretty bad policies. And, you know, at some point, I hope people will look around and ask, why did we get it so wrong? And why did the South Koreans get it so right?
Exactly. And you talk about the fact that we have, not to undermine the deaths by the pandemic, of course, but you talk about the fact that we have 60,000 deaths every month just from malnutrition. And when you compare it to the deaths by, the pandemic, it's nothing. I mean, there's no comparison. What exactly did we do wrong? Is it what you said that people should learn to listen to experts? That's one of the other lessons in the book.
I think that there wasn't enough really. You know, one of the things I say is you talk to the experts, but recognize there are many experts in many fields.
Exactly.
A lot of economists and public health experts actually were saying that in places like India, where, as you say, so many people die of other diseases, of, you know, and poverty itself produces so much death in terms of malnutrition, in terms of, you know, the cholera, typhoid. You have to be very careful about the kind of lockdown you do. So I think, firstly, India acted too hastily. A very a big lockdown in a country where, for example, in Dharavi in Bombay, where I grew up, I didn't grow up in Dharavi, I grew up in Bombay, but that slum, the density of population is 35 times higher than in New York City. So, in other words, if you tell people to stay at home, they're not socially distancing.
Yeah.
They're doing the opposite. Actually, going to work
Yeah.
would be more socially distant than going home. So first, I think the mistake was the nature of the lockdown, the length of the lockdown. There should have been all kinds of exemptions. In fact, it was brutally implemented. So as you probably remember, initially even grocery stores and pharmacies shut down because they were so scared that the police was going to punish them in some way. Since then, there has been no thought given to the economic measures that are needed to boost the country out of this growth. The entire public health apparatus should have been mobilized in a way that it hasn't been. I mean, I hate to put it this way, but Pakistan, Imran Khan basically did very little.
Yeah.
You know, and if you look at their per capita deaths, they actually have not suffered that much because he didn't do errors of commission.
Right.
By doing relatively little, he may not have helped the situation, but he didn't hurt it.
Hmm.
Whereas I have to say, the evidence is, and this is again just all in the numbers, the evidence is that what India has done has produced more deaths because of non-COVID factors, plus a decline in the economy, plus the kind of chaos that ensued, and for what? It doesn't seem to have arrested the spread of the disease much at all.
And a huge emotional and a deep emotional hurt, actually. When you look at the migrant crisis, it wasn't just a crisis of numbers, it was a crisis of humanity. You had people just abandoned, basically, and just desperate to go home, just so that they would rather die at home than in the city that had abandoned them, the cities that they had built. So you had that as well. It was a huge crisis of just, urban India turning the other way, looking the other way.
Do you know, I once talked to the chief minister of Maharashtra. This is about 10 years ago. And I was saying, why don't you try to implement the system that the Chinese have, which is that you only take in as many migrants as you need, as you can need, and you can house, and that way you don't have all these slums. And he said to me, look, one thing you have to understand, one of the glories of India is that we are a free people, we are a democratic society. We do not restrict freedom of movement. If people want to come to cities, we have to welcome them. Yes, it's very hard. Yes, it's a complicated issue. But he said, to me, this is a sign that we are a free people, that we welcome these people. We try to accommodate them. We don't treat them as if that by coming here without having asked permission of the government, they have violated some law. And I thought there was something, a very powerful point he was making there. And so you're exactly right. Looking at this migrant crisis, it's almost as though India turned into China for a month and suddenly said, you people are second-class citizens.
Yeah.
You're trapped and we're not going to do anything for you. And again, there could have been a way to handle that. And it could have been done more humanely. As you know, I mean, out of a country of 1.23 billion people, the migrant labor force isn't that large, but it really caused extreme pain there. And again, the point to remember with all these in a very poor country like India is any of these measures then produces health crises in which the number of people who fall sick and die often exceeds the number of people who are getting sick and dying of COVID.
Really, I think we've had a harrowing time. But do you think the world is turning the corner? Because the vaccines may come, but just then the distribution, who will get vaccinated in India, that is yet another crisis of enormous dimensions. Not just here, but I think the world as well has to decide how to handle that. So, what really will be going on there?
So I'm pretty optimistic, to be honest. Because I think the first phase of this pandemic was a phase that required extraordinarily competent government and public health. And it turned out that there were only a few countries that were able to do that. Some countries in Europe, some countries in East Asia, Canada, Australia, but broadly speaking, not a lot of governments had that competence. The second phase of this crisis that we are essentially about to enter is going to be one about therapeutics and vaccines. That is largely a private sector led response. And in that area, I think there's actually a great deal of competence in many parts of the world, including India. I think that one of the things that gives me hope is that in the Indian case, this second phase will be driven more by the private sector than the public sector. Even the distribution of the vaccine ultimately can be done in a public-private partnership. You never underestimate the ability of the Indian government to screw it up. But I think that for the most part, in the United States, many of these other places, what you will see, I think we will be surprised on the upside. We will be pleasantly surprised for the second phase, just as we were unpleasantly surprised on the first phase.
But as you said, buckle up. We have to now live with this. We have to live with this whole. And you yourself had predicted, Bill Gates, you said, had talked about it in 2015. You yourself had written about it in 2017, how, these epidemics are going to sort of come and, we're not prepared for it. So you say that we have to buckle up for more.
Look, in some ways, the meta lesson of the book is that the way we are living, the way we are developing, 2 billion more people in the next 25 years are going to try to achieve the same levels of, kind of lower middle class status that 2 or 3 billion people live in the world already. Those people are going to consume more. They are going to generate more waste. That model is one that is very dangerous. It's very risky. Look, I don't in any way suggest we should stop people from, raising their living standards. But I think we have to recognize that as you do this, you are creating conditions for the next pandemic, for the next heat wave, for the next drought, for the next forest fires. And if we don't plan this kind of development carefully, we will get another pandemic. I mean, this one, for example, I think it's important people understand. The reason it happened, the fundamental reason, is human development in East Asia has been crowding out the natural habitat of animals like bats. Bats have large numbers of viruses, so the bats come closer and closer to human habitation, usually to farms. From in those farms, the bat viruses jump to pigs or chickens or pangolins, and then from that, in a wild market, to human beings. That process is happening in India every day. That process is happening in Africa every day. And so it's almost miraculous that we haven't added more of these. If you think about what global warming is doing to the heat patterns, and you look at a place like Syria, where 5 million people have now left the country, the ultimate cause of the Syrian civil war, people forget, was massive heat waves induced by global warming. People left parts of the country that were uninhabitable, moved to the cities. When you have lots of people move to the cities, no jobs, that causes political protest. The regime cracked down, thus the Syrian civil war. It's not as simple as that, but there are very powerful structural forces here that are producing instability and conflict, producing instability and pandemics. And so we have to, as you said, my phrase is buckle up. Let's try to build in some resilience. Let's put some shock absorbers in. Let's buy some insurance. Let's think about how we make sure that these crises can be managed a little bit better, not so that we don't grow. We grow, but we grow in a somewhat more sustainable, somewhat more long-term oriented way.
Do you think the pandemic has taught us that? Because you talk about the three kinds of growth. You say open, fast, and stable, and you say it's very difficult to have all three. Do you think the pandemic has taught us that we really need to consume less, or was it just a momentary thing when people were all stuck at home and were feeling down, and now it's back to consuming, with ferocity that was perhaps missing earlier?
It's a very good question. I mean, in the past, you've had these pandemics and they've changed life, and sometimes you just snap back to the same. I think a lot of it depends on leadership. I really do believe that these kind of structural forces provide conditions, and then how leaders take those conditions and mold them and lead and tell, as you put it very rightly, what story they tell out of that, what narrative emerges is the key here. And I hope that the narrative that comes out of this is that we want to build a more resilient world. And we also want to build a world of greater communication and cooperation, because it's so clear that with a pandemic like this, the only solution is if we talk to one another, share information, make sure that each country knows what happened. And by the way, the Chinese are very much to blame here in not having been willing to communicate. And it shows you the downside of a closed society. A dictatorship always has this downside. Information is control, is power, and so people don't share. And yet, we have to find a way to live with. So the answer to my mind is not Donald Trump's "let's quit the World Health Organization." It's the opposite. As I write in the book, the point should be to empower the World Health Organization to demand of China that they send information, they allow inspectors. And by the way, I think you could get reforms like that passed. In the past, the blockage has been the US, which has not wanted the World Health Organization to come into the US and mosey around, So I think if we think in those broader, more long-term terms and ask ourselves, how do we build a better world out of this? I do think it could make a difference.
Do you think Biden is the right man for this? He seems to have all the credentials, but I just wonder sometimes.
Biden is the right man at two levels. One is he is an old-fashioned liberal internationalist idealist.
Right.
He wants, he believes in America's role as helping to shape and order an open world, a rule-based world. And frankly, that is what we need. We can't return to the past, but we need somebody who appreciates that legacy and is trying to rebuild it in today's very different environment with many new powers having risen. The second is within America, where a lot of the challenge is, because you have this divide. He really believes in reaching out to the other side. He really believes in compromise. he really believes in, in some effort, effort at bipartisanship. Now, look, it may not work. The world is intractable, and the world is intractable in both places. He might be disappointed at home by Republicans who just don't give him any quarter, and he may be disappointed abroad because the Chinese will want to freelance and do their own thing and are not interested in real global cooperation. But by the way, it's not just China, it's India, Brazil. I mean, the last global trade round was shot down by India and Brazil.
Right.
So there's a lot of narrow-minded thinking in the world, and these efforts to create a broader, more open world are going to be difficult. And unfortunately, why did it start? Why did it get built in the first place? Well, in the 1930s and 40s, you went through fascism, hyperinflation, a worldwide depression, and then the greatest war in human history. It sometimes takes a lot of crises to make people realize the costs of those kind of narrow-minded nationalistic views. And it's out of those crises, as I write in the book, that came the great optimism and idealism of the 40s and 50s of building this world and creating the UN and all these agencies. I hope we don't need we don't need a terrible crisis of that magnitude to make us realize the simple truth: we're all better off if we cooperate.
And indeed, so well said. But Mr. Zakaria, really, as you say, globalization is here to stay. And in fact, the kind of work that was done on the vaccine is symbolic of the fact that there's tremendous amount of uh, global cooperation between scientists from across countries, institutions, and in fact, that really is the kind of antithesis to the argument against globalization, the kind of work that was done there. So, talk a little about globalization and uh, how good a thing it is, but what needs to be done for people to accept, to accept living with it.
So, as you say, I mean, if you look at what globalization has accomplished, I mean, first of all, what do we mean by globalization? It really means the desire for human beings to be in contact with other human beings who are further and further away from them, outside of their cities, outside of their towns, and thousands of years ago. Then it became outside their regions. Then it became outside their countries. The history of humanity is really a history of globalization, of ever increasing globalization. The economic benefit to it has been enormous. I mean, if you think about the 500 million people, mostly in India and China, who have moved out of extreme poverty, that's all because of globalization. That's all because you have created a larger market, a more dynamic market. Capital has flowed all over the world. And that would not have happened. And I think, even Indians, even your viewers and readers are probably not as aware as I think they should be of just how backbreaking that kind of rural poverty is. My father's constituency was Aurangabad, which included 1,000 villages. Yeah. And you'd go to those villages, and I still remember this, and it looked like poverty out of the Middle Ages. I mean, these people were sleeping in open fields with the cattle. People would die because they would drink a glass of water, which was so infected because the village's sewage system and water supply system were the same. And so the ability to get out of that poverty is an enormous accomplishment. So we shouldn't trivialize what globalization has achieved. There is a downside, which is that the gains are spread very unequally. And they are spread in very, almost idiosyncratic ways. There's very difficult to be sure that you will have an even distribution or a relatively even distribution. And the pace can sometimes be very fast, and it can be uncontrollable. So, to my mind, the obvious solution is that you have globalization, you keep the motor of growth going, but then you use some of the gains to cushion the blow for those people who are adversely affected. You provide more and more income support. You provide more, some of the work of Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee, so powerful here, which points out that when you just give very poor people a little bit of money, they don't waste it. they don't stop working. It just creates a betterment of their life. And I would argue it creates the political basis for you to continue to have, market reforms and globalization, because they are being included in the process. In a sense, they are then becoming beneficiaries of reform and globalization rather than victims, because they benefit from the generation of of that surplus of that wealth. So to me, the answer is stay open, but stay armed with safety nets,
Right.
with shock absorbers, with education and training opportunities. Unfortunately, a lot of people look at it as an easy way to talk about close down, shut down.
Right.
I mean, Modi does this, buy Indian, but it's an odd thing, because what you're saying to people is, you're saying we want capital from all over the world.
Yeah.
We want markets. We want to be able to sell to everybody, but we want you to just buy Indian. So if everybody in the world adopted Modi's solution, of course, India wouldn't grow, because they'd all be buying local. Nobody would buy Indian.
Right.
So, there's a kind of a contradiction there. And even the most incendiary part of this globalization, or not incendiary, the part that discomforts people most, immigration. Look at the vaccines, as you were saying. Not only is it an extraordinary example of scientific cooperation around the world, of these large multinational companies that have managed to find a way to fund and provide these vaccines to countries all over the world. The two first vaccines to be announced, ironically, are both produced by immigrants.
Yes.
So, I mean, to me, that says it all.
Absolutely. And it's so good to have that conversation back in the public domain, because with an America under Trump, all these values that we hold so dear, and these are not just American values, these are human values, they were sort of being, crushed underfoot. And it was also giving a lot of, it was arming those who do not believe in these values as well, globally. A lot of people across the world, a lot of leaders across the world. So, do you feel that a new kind of leader will emerge from this, who's the opposite of the Trumps of the world, or will we still get the strong men and the strong women? I wonder.
It's a great question. I mean, the way I would put it is, unfortunately, fear sells better than hope.
Yeah.
And so people who know how to make you fear, who make you scared, are always going to be with us. And as these, the pace of change is not slowing down. And so there is a market for these leaders who say, don't worry, there's a big, bad, ugly world out there. I'm going to protect you. I'm going to protect you from the enemies without and the enemies within. And that is really the Trump Modi method, if you will. But the truth is, it is possible to fight it, but you have to fight it intelligently. I think I look at somebody like Justin Trudeau in Canada or Emmanuel Macron in France, and what they've been able to do is be, resolutely in favor of some of these trends of openness,
Right.
but they're also careful to not allow themselves to be caricatured. So
Right.
both of them, for example, are pretty tough on immigration.
Yeah.
Nothing like Donald Trump, but they are, kind of center. They take the center road on some issues like law and order, crime, immigration, so that they can't be caricatured by the right wing. It's a Bill Clinton or Tony Blair type of politics that people sometimes denigrate by calling it, centrism or triangulation or things. But the way I think of it, look, the art of politics is to manage to not allow your opponent to paint you into a corner, to caricature you. So I think we need a little bit more of that kind of politics. On the left, there tends to be a desire for total purity. And the problem with that kind of politics is, if you don't win, nothing matters, because you can't implement any ideas if you don't win. And so first you have to find a path to victory. Then you can figure out what part of your agenda to implement.
When you look at India's opposition, sometimes you seem to think that they've lost the art of winning, or even the desire to win. So a lot of what they say, for instance, you believe in it. I mean, everybody believes in the politics of love versus the politics of hatred. Who would argue against it? But they don't seem to want to, sell it hard enough or to convince enough people. Do you get that sense sometimes? They don't seem to want the victory as much as the right wing does.
Yeah, no, I think you put it exactly right. Look, a lot of politics is ambition and drive, and and a kind of ceaseless quest. And for some reason, you don't even see that. And this is one of the puzzles to me. You don't even see that very strongly at the regional level in India anymore. Everyone seems to have settled into a kind of somewhat there's a certain complacency. There's a certain and we've lapsed back. India has lapsed back into much more caste politics. I
Yeah.
thought that in some ways, the caste politics was going to be something that became less important. In the last 5 years, it feels like it's gotten more important. No, I think India is in an odd place right now. Part of it is there has not been really as much economic growth as everyone assumed there would be. You remember when India grows at 5%, it's barely, because of population growth, it's barely improving its per capita GDP. So it's essentially it's staying at a plateau.
Yeah.
So part of it is you have not been able to mobilize these new coalitions of people who I think believe in the India that I grew up in, which was a much more open, pluralistic, secular country. In many ways, it had lots of terrible ideas about economics and import substitution and all that. But I do miss the sense that I got from growing up, that there really was a celebration of everybody's heritage, their religion, their past. There was a real celebration of democratic culture. Some of those things, I think we've thrown out the baby with the bathwater in India.
And in fact, just to take off from that point, we had expected economic development to wipe out all identities. This whole identity crisis and this return to tribalism, so to speak. And we had expected economic development to do that. And in the public domain, that is still the big argument that the right wing likes to sort of talk about, but it doesn't quite practice it because we don't even have that kind of economic development as you've talked about. So this return to tribalism and this return to caste communal identities, I mean, it doesn't seem to be going away in a hurry.
There's an article in Foreign Affairs magazine in the 1960s written by the great British intellectual Isaiah Berlin called The Bent Twig. And it was a line he took from the Russian novelist Turgenev, where he said, nationalism, and I think he meant tribalism, is like one of those bent twigs that liberal intellectuals all over the centuries have always assumed this will just go away. But like the bent twig, it keeps springing back. It keeps springing back. And I think that's true. And what it tells you is that, look, human beings have a deep urge to be part of some community. And you can try to rationalize it, but that won't go away. And so the task is to find a way to take that community, that sense of belonging, but not make it exclusionary, not make it hostile to other communities. To my mind, this was always the genius of the Nehru Gandhi approach to Indian nationalism, right, which was that it never said, I want you to be less of a Hindu or a Gujarati or a Tamil, but that it celebrated the mixing and mingling and the collectivity. Right. So if you think of the national anthem itself, it's just this celebration of diversity. That's very rare. In most countries, the effort is to create some kind of amalgamated mainstream. Whereas in India, it was always about the celebration of this diversity. And the celebration that you didn't just tolerate, you actually enjoyed, yeah, the diversity. So one example I give you, when I came to America, I was struck by how everybody tolerated everybody else's religion, but nobody celebrated, right, other people's holidays. Whereas the India I grew up in, we celebrated Diwali and Holi. When for our Eid days, half the people who'd come would be Hindu. We
Right.
celebrated Christmas. My uncle actually would dress up as Santa Claus, and there was this sense in which this was all part of the kind of the diversity of the great diverse soup of India. That didn't exist in the United States. Still doesn't, by the way.
Yeah.
It was, and unfortunately, of course, that tradition itself is waned in India, and there is much more a sense of suspicion of does this mean that we have lost out and you've gained, and the renaming of towns, and
Oh, look at
this is
the
all stuff.
love jihad law. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Exactly. So the whole thing seems to be out of it's out of Orwell now.
Right. So, Mrs. Zakaria, if I were to ask you in conclusion, among the 10 lessons for a post pandemic world, which for you has been the most powerful and the one that we really, really need to heed and to understand and to practice?
Probably the one that I worry about the most is the chapter where I talk about how inequality is going to be the great lasting legacy of this pandemic, because it's so clear that it is dramatically increasing during this pandemic. Just look at us right now. We are sitting here talking digitally. We are able to, in a sense, conduct our business, our professional lives in the digital space. For the most part, people like us are able to continue to generate income in this digital space. And that's true for, most businessmen, lawyers, doctors, accountants, journalists, academics. But think about the people, who work in restaurants, hotels, in tourism, in retail malls, all these people who work with their hands, as it were, rather than their heads.
Right.
For them, this is devastating. This has been the collapse of work. This is what I think reflects the Indian economy shrinking 20, 25%, whatever it is. And that divide, unfortunately, is layered upon an existing divide, which is all the people who work in the digital space already have higher wages, already are well-to-do compared with the people who are not. So it's the lower wage workers who are being pushed even lower. The higher wage workers are being pushed higher, or at least staying the same. Same is true in companies. The big companies with brand recognition that can operate in the digital space are doing fine. It's the small dukandars who are being driven out of business. These divides are the reversal of the last 30 years of globalization and growth. And I worry a great deal about them. I think that we are going to live with this legacy. And I think we're going to live with the scars of, this kind of inequality tends to then reinforce itself, and you lose sight of the fact that this is meant to be a common endeavor. This is meant to be we're meant to try to bring people together. It widens the class divide, and I think at some level we lose sight of the fact that we're all in this together. We're all human beings. We're all in God's eyes equal, and instead we get the reification and the consolidation of these barriers and divisions.
What is the one piece of advice you give your teenager? Because she's going through an extraordinary time.
Honestly, this I think will resonate with every parent. Get off your damned phone and read. I will tell you, the world has changed a lot, but one thing hasn't changed. The only way you learn stuff is by sitting down, reading, absorbing material. It's that part is still the same. It's very old-fashioned and it's hard work.
Doesn't she tell you that she's reading on her phone and she doesn't have to read a book to do that?
And I don't believe it. I think it's all, and anything that feels, I'm a bit of a Puritan in this regard. If it feels that good, it can't be good for you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Fareed Zakaria. It was such a pleasure to talk to you. And as usual, we'll see you on GPS, I guess, this week again. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you.